My lovely guest, Brian Aquart from Why I Left podcast, is joining me today. We're talking about a podcast episode that we recorded together on my podcast, Happier at Work, a few weeks ago. Well, we recorded it a while ago, but it was released a few weeks ago. And this is really a follow up from that. We're having a chat about some of the key points that we talked about. The link to the full podcast episode is in the comments below. So if you haven't listened to the full episode, you'll find the link to it there. Today's kind of more of an update. We're going to have a bit of a chat about something in particular. I'll leave that surprise for a second. But Brian, you're so welcome. Do you want to introduce yourself to anyone who's watching today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ife, for having me. So I'm Brian Aquart. I'm the host of Why I Left, which is a podcast that really explores the Great Resignation. Right. So I've been fascinated with why people left their jobs during that time period, and I'm two seasons in right now, and so it's been great. I actually released the episode today, so episode is episode 49. Is released today with Sarah Madeira. So very, very excited to be here, and thank you for having me.
Brilliant. Well done. And we have to give a shout out actually to Bev Affield, who connected us in the first
Yes.
place. And we had a conversation about all things podcasting. We said we must do some sort of collaboration. So that would have been probably around a year ago.
Yeah,
We must do some sort of collaboration. And this year is the year for collaboration for us.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So shout out to Bev for introducing us in the first place. If you haven't listened to Brian's podcast, definitely go and check that out. I've listened to a good few episodes now and really like the style. And I love that it's based on this concept of the Great Resignation, because I think it was something that was really big. And one of the things that I took away from our conversation is that no one talks about resignations enough. We don't,
Right.
it's not something we really talk about. So I found when I was resigning I think I've resigned, I don't know, I don't want to count how many, but two in particular. I remember
Mhm.
I was like Googling, how do I resign? What do you need to say in the letter? Obviously, I know that you need to have a letter, it needs to be printed and signed. And, so I'd hand over an envelope basically to my boss. But we don't talk about these things enough about like, why do people leave and getting it out in the open? Oftentimes, I think from an organization's perspective, it's sort of hushed up, brushed under the carpet. You have a leaving party, you have a speech, and that's it sort of done. And then from an individual's perspective, they're not really going around telling people why they left unless it was a particularly toxic situation. Any thoughts on why we don't really talk about this?
Yeah, I think it's been one of these like taboo topics, and even before the whole Great Resignation and all of that. But it's one of those topics that I guess people don't like discussing because they may feel a sense of shame towards it, right? Or at times, granted, like you mentioned, if there is a toxic working relationship, there's a sense of relief when they get to leave, and they may not want to burn the bridge on the way out. Some folks may want to burn the bridge on the way
Yeah,
out,
yeah.
right? So we've seen both things, but what I got really interested in that too, right? And as the show evolves, truthfully, that's the direction I'm moving towards,
Mm.
because these past couple years, and truthfully season 3, which I'll launch next year, still focuses a little bit on the Great Resignation. But as I kind of talk to more folks, and you hear how uncommon it is that we are actually talking about these things, I want to bring that more to the forefront.
Mm.
And one of the things that's interesting, and I hear this from my guests, is that they often will like, thank you for having me on the show. I didn't get a chance to, I guess, when you asked me about this, I hadn't really processed this myself. And so, and you're going to go through the flow soon, but to see some of the questions that after I get to know you a little bit, that I draft, and then now you're really thinking about your experience. So as the show
Uh,
moves forward, I really want people to think about, not every single job that they resign from, but think of that one, that pivotal job that, it was time for me to leave this role to do whatever that thing is, whether it's go to another place or start your own thing or whatever the case may be, because there's a lot of things that happen mentally, physically, emotionally that we don't really talk about enough. And so I really want to normalize having those conversations,
mm.
because it's so true. I mean, we're all, not all of us are independently wealthy, or like most of us are working. And if we've ever worked, there's a high probability that we've often left a job before
Mm.
under a variety of circumstances. And so I want people to really talk through that. And I
Mm.
want other people to hear and understand that they're not alone.
Yeah, it's a really valuable point. Something I meant to say at the start for anyone who's watching today, whether you are watching live, whether you're watching on the replay, let us know. Drop a comment if you have anything to add to the conversation, or if you have any questions for myself or Brian. If it's live, brilliant, we can read it out and we can try and answer it live. If it's on the replay, then we can try and answer it in the comment section. But I think, Brian, you've raised some really valuable points there, and you know, there is that shame associated, I think, with leaving a job. And just because you're leaving a job doesn't mean that you're happy about it, even though you made the decision to do it. I know certainly, I'm kind of talking from my own experience that there's certain things that you do miss from being in situations that you're in. Or like you might miss the people or just being around people in general. I know certainly that's a huge change that I've had to get used to since starting my own business, is being on my own for most of the time rather than being surrounded by other people who are working together to kind of do the same thing.
Right.
But you're right, like it's something that we kind of talk about with our friends, but we don't really talk about it in a business context. How do you think
Correct.
we can get more people to talk about these types of things?
Yeah, I think it's really obviously I'm biased, but I do think that that my show kind of does help normalize those discussions, because some of the feedback that I get is around, well, oh, I saw myself in him, or I saw myself in her. Oh, I was going through that, or I'm going through that right now, right?
Mm,
And there's an aspect of the show that talks about advice where I have folks go through, if someone is looking to kind of make that jump, what would you say given your experience? And I think that's been helpful. But as a from a business standpoint, I think it's important. I know we always encourage, open dialogue, and to some extent, yes, that can happen. But truthfully, we can't always be that open with the
mm,
folks that we may report to or work with us for a variety of reasons. But I think having conversations like this, and if people start normalizing that, hey, look, it is okay at times if you need to leave somewhere. Well, what's the plan, right? More often than not, I think after a certain age, right? If you leave a role, and it's kind of an arbitrary number, but I said like 28 or 30. If you leave a role after that time, it's probably a big decision, right? Especially if
mm,
there's other familial factors in there, whatever, caregiver factors in there. And so there's a whole process that you go through. And I want people to really, like, as I continue to go through the show, that's what I want really people to dig into, right?
mm.
What is it that you did? Because even season 1 and season 2, you hear these stories of folks where they're like, hey, you know what? I knew I wanted to leave my job last year, but
Yeah.
it took me this amount of time to
Mm,
leave. And then so obviously my question is, well, why? Because that why question and that thought process that you did, maybe it's, journaling or whatever, or you had to get certain things in a row. That's the meat, right? That's what people want to hear, I think,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so if we're able to get, or if I'm able to get that word out there, maybe it then helps someone if they're in a situation that it might be time to move on from,
Mm,
that maybe it helps them plan a little bit better. One of the things I often, stress on the show with guests and everyone else is, I'm not bashing work. Like I'm not like I work 9 to 5,
yeah.
like I'm not.
Work is good.
Work, yeah, work is fine, right? It is okay, right? And I'm not, when we talk about folks who left, I don't bash the employers that
Mm,
those folks they've left from. That's not the point. The point is really it's a very personal show, right? It's a very personal show to what is it that I was doing, or what it was that I was experiencing where I needed to now move on, and here's what I did, or
mm.
truthfully, here's what I could have done better, right?
Yeah.
And maybe someone else picks up from that.
Yeah. 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 You're so right. I think you kind of touched on a couple of things that I want to pick up there. The first one is about taking personal responsibility. So oftentimes we leave our careers in the hands of other people. So, people are often surprised when I left roles. So I left one role. There's a fly here. I don't know if
Oh,
you
I
can
see
probably
it.
see
Oh,
it. You can see
yeah.
it. Yeah. This is the beauty of living in a hot country. It's not all amazing. So fly flying around trying to
Right.
land on my face. Um, so the first kind of big decision, if you like, under 30, or had just turned 30, I think. And I wanted to travel to Australia and work there for a while. And I knew I wanted to travel around Southeast Asia. So that was kind of the first major decision. And it was hard because I was living in London at the time and I loved that. So it's not always an easy decision to make. Like, that's something I knew that I wanted to do for personal reasons, that I wanted to travel and I wanted to experience living and working in another country. But then there's other times where, and I know this from friends, like they're so surprised that I didn't stick stuff out, that it wasn't working out. If I found that it was toxic, I would just leave quite quickly.
Hmm.
Whereas other people, I know it takes them quite a long time, or they just don't leave at all. They just think this work is supposed to be like this. Work is supposed to be hard. You're not supposed to have a good relationship with your manager. So I suppose the message I'm trying to get out there is that work doesn't have to be like that. Work can be a good place. And then
Yeah.
the message you're trying to work at is, yes, it's hard to leave. And we need to talk about how people resign more often. So we need to get the word out there of there's various different reasons that people do it. And it's not an easy decision to make. And sometimes it
Yeah.
takes a while before we get there. So you might be thinking about it. Like you said, you might be journaling on it. You might be thinking of all the reasons that you need to stay. A lot of time it could be financial, it could be the people that you're working with, it could be the projects that you're working on, it could be the dangling of a potential promotion in the horizon.
Yeah.
There's so many reasons that people stay in jobs for much longer than they really should. Is there anything that you've learned from your conversations, Brian, about why people do stay? So if they're thinking to themselves, I knew last year that I wanted to leave, why do they stay?
I think one of the things that I hear often about that piece, why it took so long, is because they may not have had a plan, right?
Okay.
One. And two, fear plays a huge role in all of this. I've had multiple conversations, and one actually coming up in a couple weeks where they talk about, it took me so long because I was actually afraid to do this, right? Like they set a goal for themselves to leave at this time, and this time came, and they're like, well, what am I waiting for? Right? Oh, I'm waiting for the perfect moment. But truthfully, that perfect moment doesn't exist.
No,
And so
no.
what's funny is the name of the episode is called The Perfect Moment Is Now. Right.
Yes.
And so I think that has been, and multiple, from season 1 and 2, it's really about fear. And so what I love about the show and why people, ended up, staying and obviously leaving, is that it's a show about self-actualization. In that once folks have made that decision, or they recognize that, what, this may not be for me, there's a lot of internal talk that needs to happen, whatever that looks like for you, right? But there's that talk that happens. And then even if they don't have a plan, it's that I know I need to leave here. And maybe the plan is, well, let me just save up, 3 to 6 months, and then I can be good to go. And so, sometimes I even think about my journey. Like I'm in healthcare now, but before I was on my own little like 3-year rotational with jobs and leaving, and I've left good jobs before. I didn't have bad relationships with bosses or anything like that, but it was you start hitting a ceiling type of thing for me. And I knew I wanted a little bit more. And so I've often shared, my journey a little bit on, well, here's why I decided to leave, right? I was just trying to go X role, one up, and realized that there was something that was maybe 4 or 5 steps above that I didn't think I even qualified for, but my boss told me to apply anyway.
Yeah.
And I did, and I got it. That's eye-opening, right? And so it's a variety of reasons. But a lot of times, to your initial question, it's people getting over that fear hump, right?
Yeah.
What the pandemic gave us, though, was, we had so much time to ourselves, right? If you're working remotely, or even if you're going to the office a couple times a day, there was a lot of downtime that you had. So if you were starting to have these thoughts of that, maybe this isn't the place for me, or what, I'm looking for something different, you have so much time to yourself to really sit in those thoughts, and then you have an opportunity to make it become real.
Yeah. I was going to say we're less busy, but less busy is maybe the wrong word. Just busy doing different things. I know certainly at the start of the pandemic, I noticed how much time I had, because I used to go out to events all the time during the week, and you include that travel time, and then you include the time that you're at the event, and then you include the time that it takes to get back as well. So, and I certainly, when I did leave I'm trying to think, did I have a plan? I definitely didn't have a plan
Right.
for most of the times that I've left jobs. I've just done it anyway, and I've done it I've done it afraid. The most recent role I left, I wasn't intending to set up my own business. It just wasn't a good fit for me. And the time came and I decided to leave, and I went on and I did a coaching qualification, and I did a master's in organizational behavior. And here I am now, you know, talking about the stuff that I've learned on that master's, on that journey throughout my entire career as well. So,
Yeah. And when did you recognize that? When did you recognize that it was time for you to leave that role?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it was in my most recent role. I think it was up and down for about 4.5 years. So, yeah, I think I loved it, and then I didn't love it so much, and then I loved it again, and then I didn't love it so much, and then I loved it again, and then I didn't love it so much, and then I sort of spiraled from there. I was like, this is not the place for me at all. So it was kind of a roller coaster experience, actually. In the end, ultimately, it was from a decision that I made. So I chose a particular role that wasn't suited to my strengths, I think. From an ego perspective, I was like, I get to be on the leadership team. This is incredible. And yeah, I wasn't capitalizing on my strengths. When I do a job, I want to do that job excellently. I want to do that job so well. And that role that I took didn't allow me to do that. And so I felt very stifled from what I was doing. I wasn't working to my strengths. I was doing as best as I could in that role, but that wasn't good enough for me. So yeah, so I decided to leave.
Oh, that's great. Oh, that's great. That's great.
And Brian, before we wrap things up, any parting wisdom, anything else that you'd like to share before we say goodbye today? And say goodbye to this fly.
To the fly, to the fly, our third guest, right?
Yes.
You know, what I would say is that, you know, I often talk a lot about, you know, my posts and everything, you know, the future of work, career work. That's my niche, right? And, you know, I've interviewed a lot of folks who talk a lot about working within the 9-to-5 constraints and doing other things. And I really subscribe to that a lot. And so what I would part with for folks is that it is okay to be multifaceted, if you will, and that there's nothing wrong with the 9-to-5 life, especially if you're able to do it right. Right. And so you need to figure out, or people need to figure out, what doing it right means for them. Right. There are opportunities for you to really have a nice, you know, sweet spot in the 9-to-5 life, but also there's other avenues that interest you. I mean, I'm kind of speaking to myself right now, but other avenues that interest you. And it's not because I'm trying to leave the 9-to-5 life. It's really because there's a bunch of things that interest me. Right. And so if there are a bunch of things that interest you, figure it out, try to find a way to do them, but do them in the right way. And to your point about always wanting to do whatever work that you're doing in an excellent way, to me, I'm all for that, right? Because there's like, if my regular day-to-day work was struggling because I wanted to do this podcast, that's a problem. The podcast would need to stop, right? The pod would stop, you know. But so if you're going to do that, find a way to do everything great. That's it.
Yeah. Brilliant. I love that. And if people want to connect with Brian, you're tagged in the original post of this, so people should be able to just click into your LinkedIn profile and go check you out. The Why I Left podcast page is also tagged in this, if people want to go and check that out. But also, if you want to listen to it, I'm sure you'll find it in whatever podcast platform that you want to listen to it in. And don't forget to listen to the full episode if you haven't already. My discussion with Brian about not my reason for why I left, but Brian is sharing insights and wisdom from what he's learned from doing his podcast, Why I Left. So go and check that out. Full episode, link to the full episode is in the comments below. I haven't seen any comments come in live, but if you want to drop a comment, if you're watching the replay, absolutely, I would be happy. I'm sure, Brian, you would be happy as well to answer any questions that people have. So thank you for anyone who is tuned in live today, or anyone who is watching on replay. And thank you, Brian, again for your time today. And thanks so much for your time on the podcast as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me, and keep up the great work on your show. I love listening.
Thank you.